When engineers design a bunker to survive extreme weather, the goal is purely defensive.
Right, absolutely.
You build thick concrete walls to block, blistering heat and heavy steel doors to keep out floodwater.
Yeah, it's all about keeping the outside out.
Exactly. You don't build a massive concrete blast door expecting it to accidentally turn into a thriving, beautiful nursery.
No, I mean, that would completely defeat the purpose of a blast door.
Right. But a newly published journal entry from a gardener named Ang proves that if you engineer your defenses right, that is exactly what happens.
It really is. And the document we are unpacking today for this deep dive, it was published today, actually, May 12, 2026.
Hot off the presses.
Yeah, and it details a highly specific, very experimental dual-layer mulching setup.
So, okay, Ang is using two distinct materials here, right?
Yes, LECA and coconut coir. And they're being used to survive a truly brutal tropical climate. But the fascinating takeaway for you listening, it isn't just the gardening tactic itself.
No, the mission here is bigger than that.
Exactly. It's about how an attempt to practically survive environmental whiplash, extreme weather, evolved into a completely unexpected ecosystem.
And it all happened through the simple act of decoupling defensive tasks.
Which is just a brilliant systems engineering concept applied to dirt.
It really is. But to really grasp the cleverness of this system, you have to understand the sheer biological stress the environment is putting on this garden.
Oh, it's intense.
Ang is dealing with extreme tropical weather swings. I mean, the year kicks off with a punishing heat wave stretching from January right through February.
Yeah, the soil just bakes. The entire environment basically turns into an oven.
So what does that actually do to a plant?
Well, desiccation at the root level is fatal for a garden, period.
So it just dries out and dies.
Right. When that harsh tropical sun hits bare dirt, it transfers thermal energy directly to the water molecules that are trapped within the soil.
Okay, so the water heats up?
Exactly. Those molecules gain kinetic energy, they turn into vapor, and they just escape into the atmosphere. The soil structure completely breaks down.
Turning into dry dust, basically.
Yeah, and the plants essentially starve for hydration. So the primary directive in January is intercepting that solar radiation before it ever touches the soil.
Which brings Ang to the very first line of defense, which is LCA.
LCA, yes.
And that stands for lightweight expanded clay aggregate.
Correct.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because the journal describes them as porous, dark, round clay pebbles. So imagine covering your garden in thousands of tiny, breathable clay cannonballs.
I love that analogy. Tiny clay cannonball.
Right, like they basically act like a parasol for the dirt. They take the beating of the harsh tropical sun so the moisture beneath doesn't just immediately evaporate.
That's a really accurate way to picture it. The brilliance of using an expanded aggregate like LECA lies in its thermal conductivity.
Or lack thereof, right?
Exactly, yeah. Because the clay is highly porous, right? It's filled with trapped air, and it acts as a phenomenal thermal buffer.
Because air doesn't transfer heat well.
Precisely. Air is an incredibly poor conductor of heat. So the top layer of that clay pebble gets scorching hot under the January sun, but that heat cannot easily travel through those internal air pockets down to the moisture-rich soil.
Okay, so it casts a physical shadow, but it's really those internal pockets of empty space doing the heavy lifting to stop the evaporation.
Yes. The clay takes the beating, the heat is trapped in the aggregate, and the roots stay hydrated.
It's like putting a cooler over your garden bed.
That's exactly it. The plants get to hold on to their moisture during the most critical, driest 2 months of the year.
So it's a perfectly engineered solution to a specific climate constraint.
It is. The soil is shielded, the biological stress is mitigated, and the garden survives the heat wave. Honestly, if the climate remained a static baking oven year-round, LEC would be the only tool you'd ever need.
But tropical environments are rarely static.
No, they are not.
The moment you optimize for one extreme, the system flips.
The whiplash.
Yeah, the whiplash. March arrives, the heat wave breaks, and the sky simply opens up. You go from defending against radiation to fighting gravity and water.
And this shift from a dry heat wave to the heavy downpours of the rainy season, I mean, it completely alters the mechanical requirements of the garden shield.
Because the sun and the rain attack differently.
Exactly. Ang's journal documents a total mechanical failure of the LSCA setup during this transition.
The total failure.
Yeah. The sheer physical impact of the heavy rain caused what Ang refers to as soil splashing.
Okay, wait, I have a question here.
Sure, go ahead.
If these porous clay pebbles were so good at stopping the harsh sun, why do they fail so spectacularly against the rain? Isn't it just a different element falling from the sky?
It's a great question, but you have to look at the physics of it. Sun is just radiation, right? But heavy tropical downpours are physical kinetic
Or,
impacts.
right, water has mass.
Exactly. It
Yeah.
has mass and velocity. It makes sense that LSCA blocks the sun because it casts a physical shadow over the dirt. But rain is kinetic energy.
And the shape of the LSCA matters here, doesn't it?
Crucially, if you pile a bunch of round, rigid spheres together, they will never fit perfectly flush.
Right, you can't pack marbles perfectly tight.
Exactly. You end up with inherent gaps, empty spaces channeling down between the pebbles directly to the dirt.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, those gaps are a feature when you want a breathable thermal buffer, but they become a fatal vulnerability under heavy, persistent rain.
Because the water just finds the path of least resistance.
Right. And a tropical downpour isn't a gentle mist. It is a massive volume of water dropping with significant force.
So the water channels directly through the structural gaps between the round clay pebbles
It entirely bypasses the physical barrier.
and strikes the dirt below with its full kinetic energy. That is wild.
It is. And that basically weaponizes the soil against the plant.
How so?
Well, the kinetic energy of the water displacing the dirt means fragile root systems get exposed. The nutrient-rich topsoil just washes away.
Oh, so the protective mulch layer gets completely destabilized.
Yep. The very shield built to protect the garden is basically sitting out the fight while the rain bypasses it entirely.
So Aang faced a fundamental system failure.
A huge one. The environment demanded a material that could absorb and diffuse kinetic impact without breaking its structural integrity.
And the rigid spheres couldn't do it.
Not at all. Which prompted the introduction of a completely different material into the ecosystem,
Enter the heavy lifter, coconut core.
also known as cocoa fiber.
Right. And for anyone who hasn't seen it, coconut core is essentially the tough, fibrous husk of a coconut processed down into this dense, interwoven mat or loose, fibrous texture.
Yeah, it looks a bit like tough brown steel wool made out of plants.
Good visual. And Aang's journal notes that after extensive moons of rigorous observation, this new material outperformed the clay pebbles across the board.
Oh, it wasn't just a slight upgrade. It solved the mechanical flaws of the system completely.
So what exactly did Aang measure?
Well, Aang meticulously tracked 4 specific metrics, where the coconut core proved definitively superior to the clay aggregate.
Okay, what's the first one?
First is moisture retention.
Makes sense.
Second is soil protection against that aggressive splashing we talked about. Third is weed suppression. And fourth is temperature regulation.
Okay, so when you look at the material science of it, the fibrous nature of the coir basically solves the exact structural flaw of the rigid spheres.
Exactly. Because it's an interlocking web of fibers, there are no continuous gaps for the rain to channel through.
No marble gaps.
Right. The fibrous mat physically absorbs and diffuses the kinetic energy of the raindrops before they can ever touch the vulnerable soil.
So it acts as a highly effective shock absorber.
Yes. The structural integrity holds under the deluge. Furthermore, because it is so incredibly dense and fibrous, its capacity to act as a sponge vastly outpaces the porous clay.
Oh, so it just drinks up all that rainy season water.
Exactly. It absorbs a massive volume of water, locking that moisture into its dense fibers, providing superior hydration to the roots over a much longer period.
And it's also forming a completely opaque blanket over the dirt, right? Light cannot penetrate a dense fiber mat the way it bounces through the empty gaps in a layer of loose pebbles.
Which brings us to the weed suppression.
Exactly. That means aggressive weed seeds trapped in the soil get absolutely zero solar energy to germinate.
It just stars them out.
And plus, that thick, dense, wet sponge serves as a heavy-duty insulator, regulating the temperature swings of the soil far more effectively than the clay ever did.
It really is incredible. The choir represents a robust, multifunctional solution to a highly hostile environment.
It does it all.
It really does. It manages the chaotic flow of water, it regulates the extreme heat, completely neutralizes weed competition, and it secures the underlying soil structure all at once.
But this presents a massive logical puzzle.
Oh.
Yeah, here's where it gets really interesting, but also a bit confusing to me.
Okay, let's hear it.
If the coconut core is the undisputed champion at moist retention, physical protection, weed suppression, and temperature control, why not just throw the LSCA in the trash?
Big question.
Right, like why are we calling this a dual layer setup if one layer clearly does all the heavy lifting? Logically, if you find a single tool that does all 4 critical jobs perfectly, you discard the failed tool. Why keep the rigid clay spheres at all?
That instinct, discarding an inferior tool the moment a superior one is found. That is how most of us approach basic problem solving.
Yeah, you swap material A for material B.
Exactly. But Eng's journal reveals a much deeper understanding of system design. Eng chose integration over replacement.
Integration.
Yeah. The LACA was retained, but its function within the garden was completely decoupled from survival.
Okay, so Aang notes two distinct reasons for keeping the clay pebbles around.
Right.
The first is purely aesthetic. The dark, round clay simply looks nice.
It does. It provides a clean, finished, highly textured visual surface to the garden bed.
Which, hey, we all want our spaces to look intentional.
Absolutely.
Ugh.
Nothing wrong with a good-looking garden.
But the second reason,
Hmm.
this completely flips the script on the material's structural flaw.
It really is genius. The very gaps that failed so spectacularly against the kinetic force of the rain suddenly gain a profound new utility when they are no longer required to act as a defensive shield.
Because they aren't the front line anymore.
Exactly. In Aang's final setup, the coconut core is laid down first, directly on the exposed dirt.
Okay.
It becomes the foundational heavy lifter. It absorbs the aggressive rain, it insulates against the baking heat, and it does all the grueling, brutal work of environmental regulation.
And the LCA just rests casually on top of it.
Just chill on top.
It doesn't have to defend against the scorching sun or the pounding rain anymore. It gets to exist in this perfectly stable, temperature-controlled, permanently moist microclimate created by the core underneath.
And because the core is handling the brute force defense of the ecosystem, the Lake A's porous nature, those empty spaces between the rigid spheres,
The fatal vulnerability.
right, they transform from a fatal vulnerability into a highly protected nursery.
Wow.
Seeds that drift in on the wind or are intentionally scattered by the gardener, they just fall down into those little gaps between the clay pebbles.
They settle into these tiny, perfectly sheltered pockets.
Yes.
They are shielded from the wind, they aren't drowned or displaced by splashing soil, and they rest directly on a permanently moist, nutrient-rich sponge.
By combining the two distinct materials, Aang successfully decoupled the tasks within the garden.
Layering solutions instead of swapping them.
Exactly. The dense layer handles the defensive survival. That baseline security frees up the porous layer to specialize entirely in fostering unexpected fragile growth.
The system isn't just enduring the tropical extremes anymore.
No, it's utilizing the absolute stability of the bottom layer to create unbothered opportunities on the top layer.
It is such a brilliant way to rethink how we build structures to survive difficult environments.
It fundamentally changes the paradigm.
Right. Aang proved through rigorous moons of observation that the ultimate way to survive wild extremes isn't to search endlessly for one perfect magical tool that does everything flawlessly.
Because relying on a single point of failure is rarely an optimal strategy in any complex system.
Yeah, it's just too risky.
The most resilient systems combine distinct layers, allowing materials or processes to specialize.
You secure the baseline.
Exactly. You secure the baseline so that higher level growth can occur without being constantly wiped out by the surrounding environment.
You need one robust, heavy lifting layer dedicated purely to protection, stability, and weathering the storm. That's your coconut core.
Yep.
And you pair it with a secondary layer that is open, porous, and entirely dedicated to potential growth. Your elite.
It creates a fascinating framework, honestly, for observing how we build resilience in our own lives.
Oh, totally.
We often spend all our energy optimizing our defenses, entirely forgetting to leave space for anything new to take root.
Which leaves you, the listener, with a pretty compelling question to mull over. Think about your own routines, your work, or how you handle the rainy seasons of your own life.
We all have them.
We really do. When you face extremes, are you just frantically swapping out one single tool for another, trying to find the perfect shield?
Throwing away the LSCA to find the core.
Exactly. Or could you build a dual-layer system where your baseline handles the heavy lifting of survival, leaving your top layer completely free to foster unexpected growth?
That is a great thing to think about.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Aang's 2026 journal. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and remember to check your own blast doors.
Yeah, if you layer your defenses right, you might just find a nursery growing on top of them.